This is the American Greed Podcast, presented by CNBC.
Mr. Madoff, what do you have to say for yourself?
It's one of the greatest lies ever sold. For the past decade, Bernie Madoff has been the personification of greed, locked away from the world as he serves a 150-year prison sentence. But that's not the end of the story. I'm CNBC special correspondent Scott Cohn.
And I'm Chuck Schaeffer, executive producer of the CNBC original series, American Greed. For 10 years, we've been investigating the Madoff scandal, piecing together the puzzle, speaking with the key players, including Madoff himself.
In this special podcast series, we're going behind bars to uncover Madoff today. From the lawyers,
he realized it was all over,
to the investigators,
He's a pathological liar.
to the victims,
What he did is despicable. There's no other word for it.
the financial ripple effect of his con. In this episode, hunting Bernie's billions, with his victims' lives shattered, coping with financial loss, trauma, and tragedy, the 10-year effort to make them whole. This is American Greed, Madoff, 10 years later.
Welcome to our American Greed podcast special series, Madoff 10 Years Later. I'm Chuck Schaeffer, executive producer of American Greed.
And I'm Scott Cohn, CNBC special correspondent. It's been a decade since Bernie Madoff's scandal blew up and shocked the world. And there's a story to tell about the victims. We're looking in this episode at hunting Bernie's billions.
So, Scott, this is where Bernie Madoff finds himself in the fall of 2008. He's in the hot seat to the tune of $7 billion following the September crash.
Right. I mean, this is where everything kind of comes home to roost. The financial markets are in crisis. We know about the fall of Lehman Brothers in September of that year. The U.S. economy is, and really the global economy is coming to a halt, and people want their money. They need to cover other losses and whatever. And the one place where they've made money, or so they thought, was in Bernie Madoff's fund. And so they want their money back, and he's hit in a very short period of time with $7 billion in redemptions. In other words, it's a run on the bank, essentially. But Bernie doesn't have that money. That money doesn't exist.
And in terms of the victims, we're talking about, there's some bold-faced names.
Yeah.
There were charities involved. There were obviously individuals involved. How did that play itself out?
Well, so the victims start to learn about this. The victims want to know what's happened to their money. And as you said, yeah, there are bold-faced names: Elie Wiesel, the Wilpons, owners of the New York Mets, Kevin Bacon and Kira Sedgwick, I believe, were victimized by this. So bold-faced names for sure.
Steven
Spielberg's
Foundation.
Foundation. Hadassah. I mean, there were a lot of people that invested with this guy. He was an established investment advisor and supposedly kind of a blue chip guy. Mm-hmm. So these people want to know what's going on, and so do other investors that you and I have never heard of. They had everything with this guy, or there were generations of families that had invested with Bernie Madoff, and now they've heard that he's been arrested and that his fund, where their money is a Ponzi scheme.
And since we are the media, that's where we come in.
Right.
We started chasing leads and finding out people hearing their stories. We did a story in Florida about a woman who she thought she had it made, but now she's back to making jewelry, handmade jewelry and things like that, and hopes to sell that for cash to raise some money to help her keep her home. Mm-hmm. Another case was, and we illustrated this in one of our specials, a couple, they were putting luggage into a car, getting ready to go to the airport. They weren't the travelers. They were doing a new job, shuttling people back and forth to the airports to make some extra money. Yeah. They were hurt.
Yeah. We did, we went to Palm Beach, which was Madoff's other base of operations. A close-knit but obviously very wealthy community. And a little down the road in Riviera Beach was a pawn shop. And they were seeing crazy business with people from Palm Beach coming up to pawn their goods, because this had really just thrown the whole Palm Beach scene into disarray. You talked to, I remember, Joyce Greenberg, who we've caught up with again.
10 years later.
Joyce Greenberg was living in Houston, Texas.
Yes.
Was again somebody who there was generations of wealth, who thought that she knew Bernie Madoff.
I had met Madoff. My late husband, my husband who was alive then, wanted to meet Madoff because Madoff had been managing my daughter's college funds. Madoff said that he would consider accepting money from my husband to invest, but he didn't commit himself at that time. And the following week, he phoned Jacob and told him he would accept the money. My daughter lost whatever was left in her college fund, and I have been recouping my loss, my verified loss, very slowly.
She's a wonderful woman, and she was almost the perfect person to talk to, and I'll tell you why. She kept everything, all her notes, all her records. She knew, and she will tell you this, to the penny, how much she had invested with him, how much she had gotten back from him. She had family members who had taken money out of the fund. She herself never took a penny out. She had other investments, which is, of course, her first thing she will tell you after she tells you that Bernie was, involved with NASDAQ.
Right.
But she came across as very sincere. Her life was not shattered, but her trust was shattered.
Her trust was shattered, and that's a big part of all of this. She was, again, not an unsophisticated investor. She was a retired stockbroker. But these were the kinds of stories that you start to hear, and these people want to know where their money is. So we in the media are searching for victims, telling their stories, and then there's a formal process that's going on. Again, Madoff was a registered broker-dealer with an outfit called SIPC, the Securities Investor Protection Corporation. And they are brought in at this point to search for the money, hopefully make some of these victims whole. And that brings in a guy named Irving Picard, securities lawyer, someone who was not a high-profile type of guy, but his whole mission in life from here on out to this day is finding Bernie's billions and distributing them to the investors, to the people who lost money. But when it's a Ponzi scheme, that is so much more complicated than it seems.
And it's also very rare. I mean, as we've known in stories you participated in, American Reading, we've been doing it for years, the money's gone.
Right.
The money has been spent on all sorts of bad things. Good for the perpetrator, but bad for the investors.
Right.
And in this case, Bernie Madoff he lived well, but he didn't live super well. He wasn't on page 6. He wasn't in the society pages. He gave to charities, but nothing, out of the ordinary that a wealthy person would do.
Right. So that was part of it, and you also had you had clients that you had Jeffrey Pickauer, who was one of his biggest investors, who died shortly after all of this. His widow wound up giving back upwards of $7 billion. So that's a big chunk when you're trying to recover the losses, the principal losses of $17.5 billion. Now you've got $7 billion back. That's a big leg up. And you have a dogged effort by Picard, the trustee, and his counsel, David Sheehan, to try and get this money and to go after people who took what they would call fraudulent transfers. But this is where the complicated part comes in unwinding a Ponzi scheme. Because remember, the money, the returns are not real. The money is not there. So what Picard set out to do was come up with a formula that he called net equity. So you had net winners, who are people that took out more money than they took in. They're subject to clawbacks. They got to give that money back because it was not theirs to take out to begin with. Right. And you had net losers, and the net losers were people like Joyce Greenberg, who didn't take out their money, and they should be entitled to be made whole. This created a huge controversy and actually a lot of legal precedents along the way, because on the flip side of Joyce Greenberg, you had the Kent family in Georgia, Eileen Kent and her parents.
My parents were invested with Bernie Madoff, and after he turned himself in, I joined a to victims groups, and I became a sort of a spokesperson. I mean, I did a lot of the TV interviews. I versed myself on the law. I just didn't like the fact that so many people, particularly in my parents' generation, these are, war veterans, people who built their lives and their businesses and their, professional practices from nothing. And you had teachers and construction workers that had their pensions with Madoff, that wake up one morning and it's all gone. And so now, okay, now that we know it's gone, what do we do to try to rectify it? And that came in the form of my group, Network for Investor Action and Protection.
They had taken out more than they put in. They were so-called net winners, and they wanted that money back. They felt that the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, which part of their whole charter is to guarantee securities up to $500,000, they felt that they should get at least that much money back, separate from what they took out, the so-called net winner theory that Picard was pursuing. They felt that they were entitled to that guarantee. That money doesn't come from other customers, this SIPC fund. The money comes from other brokerage firms. SIPC charges fees to Wall Street firms to be a member of this organization, and that money is supposed to be there for investors in the case of losses. Well, SIPC argued that we don't guarantee against fraud, we don't guarantee against Ponzi schemes. That's what Picard was arguing, that the only equitable way to do this was his net winner, net loser, so-called net equity theory. And this was tied up in the courts for years and years and years. Ultimately, Picard prevailed.
Well, with this idea of, and again, let's not blame the victims, but for them to feel that way, wouldn't that mean guaranteed against losses, that you'd buy stock and never lose money?
That is the argument against them, is that you're taking risk in the stock market. And they would counter and say that we invested with a member firm of SIPC. It says it on the statements. It's supposed to be guaranteed to that extent. And the question is what the guarantee covers, and this is what all was dealt with in court. So you had this situation where, people like the Kents could file a hardship exemption, which they ultimately did, so that they didn't necessarily become subject to clawbacks, and in other words, having to give back the money that they took out, which they didn't have anymore.
Of course.
But they felt that they should have been entitled to the guarantee. They shouldn't have had to go through all of the hoops that they went through to get it, to get that money back, to claim hardship and all of that. That was the basic promise, the basic bargain. But the flip side is, where is this money coming from? And do we guarantee against losses in the stock market? And the courts ultimately ruled with Picard that they're not entitled to anything other than their principal investment. And that's a precedent now for these schemes going forward. And so if you ask Eileen Kent, who wound up basically making this her job, dealing with her parents and the other victims, she said that guarantees that this will happen again, because that there will be these kinds of losses, because now that guarantee that people were counting on, that bit of assurance and that measure of confidence that you have in the markets, that's gone.
Who else can you trust? If you can't trust, nowadays I guess it's almost kind of laughable, but you got to be able to trust the government. The government said they were insured. So, to come in later and say, well, no, you're not, because it was a Ponzi scheme, is kind of ludicrous, because Ponzi schemes were not included as an exemption.
So Eileen Kent and her family, what's their situation right now?
Her parents, who were the investors, they're getting by. They're in assisted living. They're getting up there in years, certainly, and there's so much else that they've suffered in terms of the loss of trust, in terms of the loss of security. This is where people are victimized. And, you contrast that with Bernie Madoff. Yeah. Remember, when we went and visited him in 2013, he said, it's not so stressful. It's like being in the Army, but you're not worried about someone trying to kill you. He's reading books. He's someone who's respected in the prison. It's a relatively relaxing life for such a criminal.
Yeah. I think you run the gamut with the victim saying, I wanted to live a nice long life behind bars.
Yeah, I mean, you talk to the victims, and we've both talked to a number of victims over time, and you wonder, like, how would I react to somebody like that? Would I despise him? Would I curse him every living and breathing moment? I don't get so much of a sense of that. They don't want to hear about him. They don't have any use for him. And when we look at all of the different Ponzi schemes that you and I have covered over the years, most people, they're lucky if they can get pennies on the dollar. And in the aggregate, victims of the Madoff scandal are pushing now about 75 cents on the dollar when you look at Picard. Again, there's so much behind that, and it only begins to tell the story. And you talk to Bernie Madoff, and he likes to claim credit for that, which is he helped show Picard the way. He claims that he pressured Mrs. Pickauer to give that money back. There is no evidence that any of that ever occurred. They don't want to hear it. They put their trust in this guy. They put their family's trust in this guy. They believed that he was everything that he said he was, and to the tune of millions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And it was all a lie. And they're living the consequences of that. And Bernie Madoff is living a stress-free life in Butner, North Carolina.
And we're learning lessons from the victims about through their lives, through what they're doing now, in terms of their relationship with this horrible event. Right.
And they talk about asking questions that they wish they would have asked. They talk about diversifying. That's a common theme that you hear from everybody.
Sure.
And look, we talk about it all. We talk about it on CNBC all the time. Anybody that gives you any sort of investment advice talks about diversifying. But oftentimes you think about, well, I'm diversifying asset classes.
Right.
But what about where I put my money?
Yeah.
If you're not absolutely sure that where you're putting your money is reliable, is legitimate, is not a Ponzi scheme.
Correct.
Don't put it all in one place. Don't rely on the reputation of the former chairman of the NASDAQ or whoever that may be. Look beyond that and think about, how am I being scammed? Be on guard. The minute that you look at these victims and you say, oh, these poor things, boy, that would never happen to me, you've set yourself up to be a victim.
You sure have. Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned in terms of the show, we deal with people all the time. They're just too trusting, and they'll do more research buying a used car than they will about the finances for their future.
Yeah.
And so they really need to up their game, and I don't want to blame the victims, but I do want to say awareness is a key. And we, time and time again, another thing is politeness. It's going to sound completely crazy. But a lot of times, a lot of the offers are made over the phone. Somebody gets on a phone, and these people are too polite to hang up.
Do you think that there's some, there are ways that people watch American Greed.
Sure.
And there's the whole Schadenfreude thing. There's and thinking, well, that could never happen to me. I'm too smart, and I feel superior to these poor victims. And I guess that's one way of watching American Greed. But you like to think that people are watching it also to learn lessons. That there is a takeaway. And that's I think a good tip for all of the many viewers of American Greed to say, look, don't just look down on these people. Think about, what am I doing that's similar?
I always like to make these people into real people, not just victims, because you want to know that they have lives. They are working people. They have jobs. They have educations. They are not dumb people, but they find themselves trusting the wrong person.
Yeah.
The other thing is we also get a lot of people watch us say, "Man, I can run a Ponzi scam like that." So there's both.
That's another way
Yeah.
not to watch American Greed.
Exactly. There's that element.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, Scott, the one thing that I hope people learn in this series is just the idea of protect yourself.
Right. We look at the Madoff scandal. Kind of is movies. There's books. There's all this popular culture surrounding it. But it really should be more than that. All of those forces that were at play in the Madoff scandal as it unfolded 10 years ago and as it was developing before that, they're still there. The psychology of trust, of trusting a professional, of wanting to make a little bit of extra money, of having that edge that blinds you to the questions you should be asking. That's all still there. And so people do need to be careful about being trusting. They need to be careful about where they put their money or anything else where they're entrusting a professional. Don't take it at face value, because as sure as Madoff happened once, something like it is going to happen again. Well, we thank you for joining us for this American Greed podcast special, Madoff 10 years later. I'm CNBC special correspondent Scott Cohn.
And I'm Chuck Schaeffer, executive producer of the CNBC original series, American Greed.
Be sure and catch all of our American Greed podcasts. Subscribe today.
Thanks for listening to the American Greed Podcast, presented by CNBC.